The bruises on Zoe Faulkner's hands stung as the harsh lye soap bit into her raw skin. But it was nothing compared to the ache in her back after 14 hours of scrubbing the floors of the Silver Dollar Saloon in Aurora, Colorado. The spring of 1878 had brought nothing but misfortune since she'd arrived 3 weeks ago with nothing but hope and her mother's locket. "You missed a spot," barked Hiram Voss, the saloon owner, pointing to a dark stain near the bar with his polished boot. His thick mustache twitched with disdain. "I don't pay you to daydream, girl." "Yes, Mr. Voss," Zoe murmured, crawling across the rough wooden planks to attack the whiskey stain. At 22, she had imagined a different life for herself when she'd left Missouri after her parents' passing. The advertisement for work in the booming mining town had promised decent wages and respectable employment. What she'd found instead was backbreaking labor, meager pay, and quarters hardly bigger than a closet above the noisy saloon. The doors swung open, bringing with them a rush of cool evening air and the silhouette of a tall man. Zoe kept her head down, focusing on the stain. Most patrons ignored her completely, which suited her just fine. The newcomers who didn't were usually the ones she needed to avoid. "Hiram," the man called out, his voice deep and steady. "I hear you've got a room for rent." Zoe glanced up despite herself. The stranger stood with his back to the dying sunlight, his face in shadow beneath a wide-brimmed hat. Dust covered his clothes, and the spurs on his boots clinked softly as he stepped further into the saloon. "Preston Quinn," Voss said warmly, extending his hand. "Heard you might be riding through. How's the cattle drive?" "Delivered and paid for," the man Preston replied, removing his hat to reveal tousled dark hair and a face weathered by sun and wind. He couldn't have been more than 30, but his eyes carried the weight of someone who'd seen far more than his years suggested. "Looking for a place to stay while I sort out some business in town." Zoe returned to her scrubbing, trying to make herself invisible. It never paid to draw attention in a place like this. Her knuckles cracked as she wrung the rag into her bucket, the water already a murky gray. "We've got a room," Voss said. $2 a night includes breakfast." He paused. "Though our girl here ain't much of a cook." Zoe felt the man's gaze fall on her and she hunched her shoulders, continuing her work. "What happened to Martha?" Preston asked. "She's been running this place with you for years." "Consumption took her last winter," Voss replied, his voice momentarily softening. "Been making do since then." "I'm sorry to hear that." The conversation drifted to other topics as Voss led Preston to the bar for a drink. Zoe finished with the stain and moved to the next section of floor, her knees protesting every movement. Another hour and she'd be done for the night. Then she could retreat to her tiny room and soak her hands in the cold water she'd saved from the morning. As the evening progressed, the saloon filled with the usual crowd, miners fresh from their shifts, card players looking for a game, and local businessmen seeking respite from their wives. Zoe worked around their boots, invisible to most as they laughed and drank and argued. It was near midnight when Voss finally dismissed her. "Be up at 5 to start breakfast," he reminded her curtly. "And make sure the coffee's stronger tomorrow. Had complaints?" Zoe nodded, gathering her bucket and rags. Her dress was damp at the knees and her apron bore new stains. As she straightened, wincing at the pain in her lower back, she found Preston Quinn watching her from his seat at the corner table where he'd been nursing a whiskey for the past hour. She averted her eyes and hurried toward the back stairs that led to the cramped quarters above. Sleep would be brief, but it was the only respite she had. The next morning came too quickly. Zoe's hands had barely recovered from the previous day's abuse when she was plunged back into work, preparing breakfast for the handful of overnight guests. The kitchen was stifling already, despite the early hour, and she fought to keep the bacon from burning while simultaneously stirring a pot of oatmeal. "Need a hand?" she startled, nearly dropping the wooden spoon. Preston Quinn stood in the doorway to the kitchen, his tall frame filling the space. "I'm fine, thank you," she replied automatically, turning back to the stove. "Those don't look fine," he said, nodding toward her hands. Zoe glanced down at her reddened, cracked skin. "It's nothing. Got some salve in my saddlebag that might help. My mother used to make it beeswax and calendula. Works wonders on rope burns and the like." Before she could respond, Voss appeared behind Preston. "Quinn, your breakfast is served in the dining room. Girl, mind those biscuits, they're burning." Zoe hurried to rescue the biscuits from the oven, and by the time she turned around, Preston was gone. She told herself it was better that way. Kind gestures in places like this usually came with expectations she couldn't afford to meet. The day unfolded like the one before it, and the one before that. More floors to scrub, more meals to prepare, more orders to follow. By mid-afternoon, Zoe was cleaning the private parlor where Voss conducted his business meetings when the door opened unexpectedly. "Sorry," Preston said, pausing in the doorway. "Didn't know anyone was in here." "I'm just finishing," Zoe replied, gathering her cleaning supplies. The room was small, and his presence seemed to fill it completely. Instead of leaving, he stepped inside and closed the door partway. "I brought this," he said, holding out a small tin. "For your hands." Zoe stared at the offering, uncertain. "Why would you do that?" "Because I've worked with my hands my whole life, and I know what it's like when they're too raw to be useful." He set the tin on a nearby table. "Use it or don't. But it might make tomorrow's work a little less painful." There was something in his directness that made Zoe believe him. "Thank you," she said quietly. He nodded, and for a moment they stood in silence. Zoe noticed that his eyes were a deep blue, like the sky just before dusk. "How long have you been working for Voss?" Preston asked. 3 weeks, Zoe replied. "I came from Missouri after." She stopped herself. There was no need to share her history with a stranger, no matter how kind his gesture. "After whatever brought you here," he finished for her. "Aurora's a tough town for a woman alone." "I manage," she said, lifting her chin slightly. A smile touched the corner of his mouth. "I can see that." He moved toward the door. "I'll let you finish your work." As he left, Zoe picked up the tin he'd left behind. The metal was worn smooth from use, and when she pried off the lid, the earthy scent of herbs filled her nostrils. She hesitated only briefly before dipping a finger into the salve and rubbing it gently into her worst cracks. The relief was immediate, a cooling sensation that eased the burning. Later that night, after the last patrons had stumbled home and Zoe had finished the final chores, she retreated to her room with the tin of salve. She sat on her narrow bed, applying the ointment carefully to each finger, each palm. As she worked, she found herself wondering about Preston Quinn. Cowboys passed through Aurora regularly on their way to and from the cattle markets, but few took notice of a cleaning woman with raw hands. A commotion from the street drew her to the small window. In the moonlight, she could make out several figures in front of the saloon. One of them was Preston, standing calmly as 3 men circled him. Even from her vantage point, she could tell they were spoiling for a fight. "You don't belong here, Quinn," one of the men said loudly enough for his voice to carry. "Crowfield sent us to make sure you understand that." "Crowfield doesn't own Aurora," Preston replied evenly. "And I've got business that doesn't concern him." "Everything in this county concerns Mr. Crowfield," another man snarled. Zoe tensed as the first punch was thrown. Preston ducked it easily and responded with a swift jab that sent his attacker stumbling backward. The other 2 rushed him at once, and the fight erupted in earnest. Despite being outnumbered, Preston held his own. His movements were controlled, efficient, lacking the wild swings of a barroom brawler. Zoe realized he was fighting defensively, not looking to hurt the men but simply to keep them at bay. The scuffle ended when the town marshal's deputy appeared, shouting for them to break it up. The three men backed away, one of them spitting on the ground near Preston's feet before they retreated into the shadows. Preston straightened his vest and exchanged words with the deputy that Zoe couldn't hear. After the lawman left, Preston stood alone in the street for a long moment, looking up at the saloon. His gaze traveled to her window, and Zoe stepped back quickly, though she was sure he couldn't see her in the darkness. The next morning, Zoe's hands felt remarkably better as she prepared breakfast. The salve had worked just as Preston had promised. When he came down for his meal, his right eye was shadowed with a bruise, but otherwise, he showed no signs of the previous night's altercation. "Good morning," he said, taking a seat at the counter where she was serving. "Sleep well." "Well enough," she answered, pouring him coffee. "And you, no trouble sleeping after your exercise last night?" A flicker of surprise crossed his face before he smiled. "You saw that, did you?" "My window overlooks the street," Zoe explained, pushing a plate of eggs and bacon toward him. "Who's Crowfield?" Preston took a sip of coffee before answering. "Jeremiah Crowfield. Owns the biggest ranch in the territory and thinks that gives him the right to decide who comes and goes in these parts." "And why doesn't he want you here?" "That's a long story," Preston replied, cutting into his eggs. "But the short version is that I used to work for him, and we had a disagreement about how his men treated the smaller homesteaders. I left, and he took it personally." Zoe studied him as he ate. There was more to the story, she was certain, but she didn't press. "Thank you for the salve," she said instead. "It helped. Glad to hear it." He finished his breakfast quickly, leaving a generous tip beside his plate. "I've got some business to attend to. See you this evening." As he walked out, Hiram Voss emerged from his office, eyeing the departing cowboy with suspicion. "What did Quinn want?" he asked Zoe. "Just breakfast," she replied, collecting Preston's empty plate. Voss grunted. "Stay away from him, he's trouble." "I don't socialize with the guests, Mr. Voss," Zoe assured him, though she wondered what Voss knew about Preston that made him wary. The day passed in its usual rhythm of chores and service. By mid-afternoon, Zoe's back was aching from hauling water to fill the bathtub for one of the guests. As she made her way down the back stairs with an empty bucket, she overheard voices from Voss's office. "Quinn's been asking questions all over town," a man was saying. "Went to the land office this morning." "What's he after?" Voss asked. "Records of the sale. Wants to know who really owns the property." "Crowfield won't like that. Crowfield's the one who sent me to tell you. Says to keep an eye on Quinn and let him know if he does anything suspicious." "And what do I get for my trouble?" Voss demanded. The visitor lowered his voice. "The usual arrangement. Plus, if Quinn happens to be permanently discouraged from his inquiries, there's an extra 50 in it for you." Zoe backed away silently, her heart pounding. Whatever business Preston had in Aurora, it was dangerous enough that someone wanted him permanently discouraged. The euphemism sent a chill down her spine. That evening, Preston returned later than usual. The saloon was crowded, and Zoe was busy serving drinks when he entered. His expression was grim as he made his way to the bar, ignoring the hostile stares from several patrons. "Quinn," Voss greeted him with false heartiness. "Beginning to think you'd found other accommodations." "Had a lot of ground to cover today," Preston replied, accepting the whiskey Voss poured him. "Interesting town you've got here, Hiram. Lots of secrets." Voss's smile tightened. "Every town has its share, some more than others." Preston took a slow sip of his drink. "For instance, I was surprised to learn that the deed to this saloon is held by Jeremiah Crowfield, not you." The conversation around them dimmed as people tuned in to the exchange. Voss's face darkened. "My business arrangements are none of your concern." "Maybe not," Preston agreed. "But when those arrangements involve forcing honest folks off their land through fraud and intimidation, it becomes my concern." "You should watch your accusations," Voss warned, his hand drifting beneath the bar where Zoe knew he kept a shotgun. "Not an accusation," Preston said calmly. "Just wondering why a man who claims to be an independent business owner is actually Crowfield's puppet. And why the previous owner of this establishment, who refused to sell to Crowfield, suddenly died of consumption last winter." The silence in the saloon was complete now. Zoe froze with a tray of empty glasses in her hands, watching the tension build between the two men. "I think you've had enough to drink," Voss said coldly. "And I think your room is no longer available." Preston set his glass down with deliberate care. "That's fine. I've seen what I came to see." He turned to survey the room, his gaze landing briefly on Zoe before addressing the crowd. "Folks might be interested to know that Crowfield's been forging documents at the land office. Anyone who's lost property to him in the last year might want to check on the legitimacy of those transactions." "Get out," Voss snarled, pulling the shotgun from its hiding place. "Now." Preston didn't flinch. "I'm going. But this isn't over, Hiram." He backed toward the door, eyes never leaving the barrel of the gun. "Not by a long shot." As he reached the exit, he looked at Zoe again. Something in his expression made her stomach tighten, a warning, perhaps, or a goodbye. Then he was gone, the swinging doors closing behind him. The saloon erupted in conversation. Voss slammed the shotgun on the bar, making everyone jump. "Back to your drinks," he shouted. "Show's over." He beckoned to one of the regular patrons, a man Zoe had seen speaking with the visitor earlier. They huddled in conversation for a moment before the man hurried out through the back door. Zoe resumed collecting glasses, her mind racing. Preston had as good as accused Voss of being involved in Martha's death, and now he'd left, possibly for good. She shouldn't care, he was just a guest, a stranger who'd shown her a small kindness. But the thought of him riding into an ambush made her chest tighten with anxiety. She worked mechanically for the next hour, keeping her head down and her ears open. Voss was drinking heavily, his face flushed with anger as he muttered to himself behind the bar. When he finally called for her to clean up, it was well past midnight. "I'm going out," he told her, reaching for his coat. "Lock up when you're done." "Yes, Mr. Voss," she replied, not meeting his eyes. After he left, Zoe moved quickly, finishing her tasks in half the usual time. Then, instead of heading up to her room, she slipped out the back door into the alley. The spring night was cool, and she pulled her thin shawl tighter around her shoulders as she made her way toward the livery stable. She wasn't sure what she was doing or what she hoped to accomplish. But something told her that Preston Quinn was in danger, and she couldn't simply go to bed knowing she might have helped prevent whatever was coming. The livery was dark except for a single lantern hanging near the entrance. Zoe approached cautiously, hearing voices from inside. She crept closer, staying in the shadows of a neighboring building. "Waiting at Cottonwood Creek," someone was saying. "4 of Crowfield's best men. Quinn won't make it to the county line." "Good," replied a voice she recognized as Voss's. "Make sure there's nothing to connect it back to us." "Just another unfortunate incident on the trail." "What about his belongings?" a third voice asked. "I'll take care of those," Voss said. "He's got a room full of papers that need to disappear before the marshal starts asking questions." Zoe's breath caught in her throat. They were planning to murder Preston and destroy whatever evidence he'd gathered against Crowfield. She needed to warn him, but she had no idea where he'd gone. The men continued talking, and Zoe strained to hear more details. Cottonwood Creek was about 5 miles east of town. She knew that much. If Preston was heading that way, she might still have time to reach him. She was about to retreat when a hand clamped over her mouth from behind. She tried to scream, but the sound was muffled against the palm. Quiet. A familiar voice whispered in her ear. "It's me, Preston." Relief flooded through her as he slowly removed his hand. He motioned for her to follow him away from the livery, keeping to the darkest parts of the alley until they were a safe distance away. "What are you doing here?" he demanded in a hushed voice once they were out of earshot. "Warning you," Zoe replied. "Voss and some others, they're planning to ambush you at Cottonwood Creek." Preston's expression shifted from anger to surprise. "And you came to tell me?" Why? The question caught her off guard. Why had she risked herself for him? "Because it's wrong," she said finally. "What they're doing is wrong." He studied her face in the dim light of the stars. "You could get yourself killed, getting involved in this." "I'm already involved," Zoe said. "I work for a man who's apparently willing to commit murder for Jeremiah Crowfield, and after what you said tonight." Was Martha really murdered? Preston's jaw tightened. "I can't prove it yet, but yes, I believe so. Martha Simmons was my aunt. She wrote to me last winter, saying she feared for her life after refusing to sell the saloon to Crowfield. By the time I got her letter, she was already dead." "Your aunt," Zoe echoed, understanding dawning. "That's why you came to Aurora." "To find out what happened to her and to gather evidence against Crowfield," he confirmed. "I've spent the last 3 days collecting testimonies from people who have been cheated out of their land. The circuit judge arrives next week, and I intended to present everything to him then. But now Crowfield's men are waiting to kill you, and Voss is going to destroy your evidence," Zoe said, "which means I need to leave town tonight with everything I've gathered." Preston ran a hand through his hair. "And you need to go back to the saloon before they realize you're gone." Zoe shook her head. "I can't go back there, not now that I know what Voss is capable of." "It's too dangerous for you to come with me," Preston argued. "Crowfield's men will be watching every road." "I know a way," Zoe said suddenly. "There's an old miner's trail that leads east through the hills. It connects to the main road about 10 miles out, past Cottonwood Creek. The locals use it when the creek floods." Preston raised an eyebrow. "How do you know about that?" "I listen," Zoe replied simply. "People talk freely around a woman scrubbing floors. They don't think I'm paying attention." A slow smile spread across Preston's face. "Zoe Faulkner, I believe you're more resourceful than I gave you credit for." His expression grew serious again. "But I still don't think I'm coming with you," Zoe interrupted, her decision made. "I have nothing here worth staying for, and if I remain, Voss will know I warned you. I'd rather take my chances on the trail." Preston looked like he wanted to argue further, but instead he nodded. "All right, but we need to move fast. I have a horse at the edge of town, and my papers are hidden where they won't think to look." "I need to get something from my room first," Zoe said. "Too risky." Voss could return at any moment. "It won't take long," she insisted. "And it's important." After a moment of hesitation, Preston agreed. "Be quick. Meet me behind the church in 15 minutes. If you're not there, I'll have to assume something went wrong." Zoe nodded and hurried back toward the saloon, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and exhilaration. She was about to leave everything behind, not that she had much to leave. But the uncertain future ahead somehow felt less daunting than the certainty of remaining under Voss's employ. She slipped into the saloon through the back door and up the stairs to her tiny room. Working by moonlight to avoid attracting attention, she stuffed her few belongings into a small bag. A change of clothes, her mother's locket, and the tin of salve Preston had given her. She hesitated, then added the small amount of money she'd managed to save, hidden beneath a loose floorboard. As she was about to leave, a thought struck her. Voss kept records of all his transactions in a ledger he stored in his office. If Preston was gathering evidence against Crowfield, those records might be valuable. Descending the stairs silently, Zoe made her way to Voss's office. The door was unlocked. He rarely bothered securing it when he was in the building. She found the ledger in the top drawer of his desk and quickly leafed through it. Page after page detailed payments from J.C., alongside notes about property acquisitions and special arrangements. It was exactly what Preston needed. She tucked the ledger into her bag and was about to leave when she heard the front door of the saloon open. Voices echoed in the main room. Voss had returned, and he wasn't alone. Zoe froze, her mind racing. The only exit from the office led directly past the bar. She was trapped. "Check upstairs," Voss ordered someone. "Make sure she's in her room. If Quinn contacted her, she might know something." Heavy footsteps ascended the stairs. Zoe looked around desperately for a hiding place. The office had a window, but it was small and overlooked the main street, too exposed for an escape. The footsteps reached the top of the stairs. She had seconds at most. Making a split-second decision, Zoe ducked beneath Voss's desk, pulling the chair in as close as possible to shield her from view. She held her breath as the man searched her room, then called down to Voss. "She's gone. Bed's empty, and some of her things are missing." Voss cursed loudly. "She must have overheard us. Check the rest of the building." Zoe's heart hammered against her ribs as footsteps approached the office. The door swung open, and lantern light flooded the room. From her hiding place, she could see Voss's boots as he entered, followed by another pair belonging to his companion. "She's taken the ledger," Voss said, his voice tight with fury as he yanked open the drawer where it had been kept. "That little witch is working with Quinn." "We need to find them before they get too far," the other man said. "If that ledger reaches the judge, I know what's at stake," Voss snapped. "Get the horses, and send word to the men at Cottonwood Creek to be on the lookout for a woman traveling with Quinn." The men left the office, and Zoe waited until their voices faded before emerging from her hiding place. She had even less time than she'd thought. Checking that the coast was clear, she hurried to the back door and slipped out into the night. The church stood at the end of the main street, its white steeple visible in the moonlight. Zoe kept to the shadows, moving as quickly as she dared through back alleys and between buildings. Twice she had to duck out of sight as men on horseback galloped past, clearly part of the search party Voss was assembling. When she finally reached the church, she hesitated. What if Preston had already left without her? What if this was a trap? Zoe. She nearly cried out in surprise as Preston materialized from the darkness beside the building. He was leading a saddled horse with another tethered behind it. "I thought you weren't coming," he said, relief evident in his voice. "I got delayed," she replied, catching her breath. "But I found something that might help your case." She pulled the ledger from her bag. Voss's records of his dealings with Crowfield. Preston's eyes widened as he flipped through the pages. "This is even better than I'd hoped for. Names, dates, amounts, it's all here." He looked at her with newfound respect. "You're full of surprises." "They know I'm gone," Zoe said urgently. "They're searching for both of us." Preston nodded, stowing the ledger in his saddlebag. "Then we'd better not waste any more time. Can you ride?" "Well enough," Zoe said, though it had been years since she'd been on horseback. He helped her mount the second horse, a gentle mare with a white blaze on her forehead. "Stay close to me," he instructed, swinging up onto his own horse. "The trail you mentioned, can you find it in the dark?" Zoe oriented herself, recalling the directions she'd overheard in the saloon. "It starts near the old silver mine, about a mile east of town." They set off at a careful pace, avoiding the main roads and keeping to the tree line whenever possible. The night was clear, with enough moonlight to see by without lanterns that might give away their position. As they rode, Zoe felt a strange mixture of terror and freedom. For the first time since arriving in Aurora, she was making her own choice rather than following orders. They found the miner's trail where Zoe had expected it to be, a narrow path that wound up into the foothills before cutting eastward. As they ascended, she glanced back at the town below. Lanterns were moving through the streets like fireflies, the search for them clearly underway. "We need to keep moving," Preston said, following her gaze. "They'll figure out which way we've gone by morning." The trail was rough and in places barely discernible, but their horses navigated it surely. Preston led the way, occasionally reaching back to make sure Zoe was still close behind. The night grew colder as they climbed higher, and Zoe shivered in her thin dress and shawl. Noticing her discomfort, Preston reined in his horse and dismounted. From his saddlebag, he withdrew a worn leather coat, which he handed up to her. "It's not much, but it's better than what you've got." The coat was too large for her slender frame, but it was warm from being packed against the horse. "Thank you," Zoe said, slipping it on. The leather carried the scent of tobacco and pine. Preston's scent, she realized. He remounted, and they continued in silence for a time, the only sounds the steady clopping of hooves on the rocky trail and the occasional call of a night bird. "Why did you come to Aurora?" Preston asked eventually. "The real reason." Zoe hesitated, then decided there was little point in holding back now. "My parents died last winter, influenza. They had a small farm in Missouri, but it was mortgaged. The bank took everything." She swallowed hard at the memory. "I saw an advertisement for work in Colorado. New opportunities in the mining towns. It seemed like a chance to start over." "And instead, you ended up scrubbing floors for a criminal," Preston said softly. "It wasn't what I'd hoped for," Zoe admitted, "but I didn't have enough money to go elsewhere once I arrived. And then—" She trailed off, embarrassed to admit how trapped she'd felt. "And then it's hard to leave when you're barely making enough to feed yourself," Preston finished for her. "I've seen it before. Towns like Aurora are built on the backs of people who can't afford to walk away." "What about you?" Zoe asked, changing the subject. "You said Martha was your aunt, but there must be more to it than family loyalty." Preston was quiet for so long that Zoe thought he might not answer. "I used to work for Crowfield," he said finally. "Started as a ranch hand when I was 16, worked my way up to foreman by 25. I believed in what we were doing, running cattle, helping to feed the territory. What changed? I started to see how Crowfield operated. The way he'd force smaller ranchers and farmers to sell, sometimes through threats, sometimes through more underhanded means, poisoning wells, stampeding cattle through crops." Preston's voice hardened. "When I objected, he told me it was just business. When I threatened to go to the authorities, he reminded me that he owned the sheriff and half the judges in the territory." "So you left?" "I did more than leave. I gathered what evidence I could and took it to a federal marshal I knew from my Army days. Started an investigation." Preston looked over his shoulder at her. "That's why Crowfield wants me dead. I'm not just a former employee who knows too much. I'm actively working to bring him down." Zoe digested this information as they rode. The man beside her was risking his life for justice in a land where justice was often whatever the powerful decided it should be. It was more than admirable, it was rare. Dawn was breaking by the time they reached the point where the miner's trail rejoined the main road. They paused at the intersection, listening carefully for any signs of pursuit. "We're past Cottonwood Creek," Preston said, consulting a small map he'd pulled from his pocket. "But they'll have scouts all along this road. We need to decide where to head next. How far to the circuit judge? Zoe asked. He'll be in Pueblo, about 50 miles south of here. Preston frowned. But that's where they'll expect us to go, and it's too far to reach before they catch up to us. What about the federal marshal you mentioned? Preston shook his head. He's in Denver, even further away. Zoe thought for a moment. Is there somewhere closer where we'd be safe until the judge arrives in Pueblo? Preston studied his map. There's a settlement about 15 miles east of here. Miller's Crossing. Small place, but they've had their own troubles with Crowfield. Might find sympathetic ears there. Then that's where we should go, Zoe decided. They turned their horses eastward, keeping a steady pace that wouldn't exhaust their mounts but would put distance between them and their pursuers. As the sun rose higher, the spring day warmed and Zoe shed Preston's coat, tying it to her saddle. Around mid-morning, they paused to rest the horses and eat some of the jerky and hardtack Preston had in his provisions. They found a small stream where they could refill their canteens and allow the animals to drink. Zoe splashed water on her face, washing away the dust of the trail. Her hands, though still bruised, were less painful thanks to the salve. As she dried them on her skirt, she caught Preston watching her. "What?" she asked. "I was just thinking that you're not at all what I expected when I first saw you scrubbing floors in the saloon," he replied. "And what did you expect? Someone broken by circumstance." "But you're not broken, are you, Zoe Faulkner?" The question caught her off guard. "I don't know," she said honestly. "Sometimes I've felt close to it." Preston moved closer, taking one of her hands in his to examine the bruises. "Broken things don't heal this quickly," he said softly. "And they certainly don't risk everything to help a stranger." His touch sent a warmth through her that had nothing to do with the spring sunshine. Zoe looked up into his face, noting the way the corners of his eyes crinkled when he smiled, the stubble on his jaw from a night without shaving, the small scar above his left eyebrow. He wasn't conventionally handsome, perhaps, but there was something compelling about his features' strength and kindness, in equal measure. The moment was broken by the distant sound of hoofbeats. Preston dropped her hand and moved quickly to the horses, untethering them from the trees where they'd been resting. "At least 4 riders," he said grimly, helping Zoe into her saddle. "Coming from the west." They urged their horses back onto the road, pushing them into a gallop. Zoe clung to her saddle, the wind whipping her hair behind her as they raced eastward. The pounding of hooves behind them grew louder. Their pursuers had spotted them and were giving chase. "There," Preston pointed to a stand of cottonwoods about a quarter-mile ahead. "We'll cut through there and try to lose them in the ravine beyond." They veered off the road, the horses' hooves kicking up dust as they charged toward the trees. Bullets whistled past them, and Zoe ducked instinctively, pressing herself close to her horse's neck. The cottonwoods provided momentary cover, but their pursuers were closing in. As they emerged on the other side, Preston suddenly pulled up short, forcing Zoe to rein in her horse as well. Before them, the ground fell away in a steep ravine, too dangerous to descend at speed. They were trapped. "This way," Preston said urgently, turning his horse to the north, parallel to the ravine. "There's a crossing further up." They rode hard, the gunfire behind them sporadic now as their pursuers navigated through the trees. The ravine gradually became less steep, and Preston led them down its side, zigzagging carefully to keep the horses from losing their footing on the loose soil. At the bottom, a shallow creek gurgled over smooth stones. They splashed through it and continued up the far bank, finally pausing in a dense thicket to catch their breath and listen. "I think we've lost them for the moment," Preston said, his voice low. "They'll have to find a way down that doesn't kill their horses." "What now?" Zoe asked, trying to control her racing heart. We continue east, but off the main road. Preston consulted his map again. There's a back way into Miller's Crossing that follows this creek. It'll take longer, but it's safer. As they set off again at a more moderate pace, Zoe noticed that Preston was holding his left arm stiffly. "You're hurt," she said, alarmed. He glanced down at the tear in his shirt where a dark stain was spreading. "Just a graze. Bullet caught me as we entered the trees. It's nothing." "It's not nothing," Zoe insisted. "We need to stop and bandage it." "Not yet," Preston said firmly. "Not until we're farther from them." They rode for another hour, following the meandering creek through increasingly wooded terrain. The sounds of pursuit had faded entirely, but Preston remained vigilant, frequently checking their back trail. When they finally stopped in a secluded clearing, Preston's face was pale beneath his tan, and the bloodstain on his sleeve had grown. Zoe helped him dismount and sit against a tree while she gathered what she needed from the saddlebags. "Take off your shirt," she instructed, laying out the canteen, a clean bandana and the tin of salve. Preston raised an eyebrow despite his pain. "Forward, aren't you?" "Don't flatter yourself," Zoe retorted, though she felt her cheeks warm. "I can't treat a wound I can't see." He complied with a wince, unbuttoning his shirt to reveal a lean, muscled torso marked with old scars. The bullet had carved a furrow across his upper arm, bloody but not deep. Zoe cleaned the wound carefully with water from the canteen, then applied some of the salve before binding it with the bandana. Preston watched her work, his expression unreadable. "You've done this before," he observed. "My father was prone to accidents on the farm," Zoe explained. "And we were too far from town to call a doctor for every cut and scrape." When she finished, her fingers lingered for a moment on his arm, feeling the warmth of his skin beneath the bandage. She quickly withdrew her hand, busying herself with repacking their supplies. "Thank you," Preston said quietly, "for this, and for the ledger, and for warning me in the first place." Zoe met his gaze. "I think we're beyond keeping score." They rested longer than planned, both of them exhausted from the night's ride and the morning's chase. Despite the danger, Zoe found herself dozing against a tree trunk, lulled by the sound of the creek and the gentle rustling of leaves overhead. When she awoke, the sun had moved significantly across the sky, and Preston was studying his map again, his shirt back on but unbuttoned at the collar. "We should reach Miller's Crossing by nightfall," he said when he noticed she was awake, "assuming we don't run into any more of Crowfield's men." "And then what?" Zoe asked, stretching her stiff limbs. "Then we find somewhere safe to wait until the circuit judge arrives in Pueblo," Preston replied. "With the evidence we have, your testimony about what you overheard, Voss's ledger, the statements I've gathered from others, we should have enough to convince the judge to issue warrants for Crowfield and his associates." "And after that?" The question slipped out before Zoe could stop it. She hadn't thought beyond their immediate survival, but suddenly she wanted to know what came next for both of them. Preston looked at her thoughtfully. "After that, justice runs its course. Crowfield goes to prison, hopefully. The land he stole gets returned to its rightful owners." He paused. "And you? What do you want, Zoe, once this is over?" It was a question she hadn't allowed herself to consider in weeks. What did she want? Not to return to scrubbing floors, certainly. "But beyond that, I want to stop running," she said finally. "Find somewhere I can build something of my own." "Something that can't be taken away." Preston nodded as if her answer made perfect sense to him. "That's a good want," he said. "Simple but not easy." "What about you?" Zoe asked. "What happens to Preston Quinn after Crowfield is brought to justice?" "I haven't thought that far ahead," he admitted. "For the past year, bringing him down has been my only focus." He looked at her with a half smile. "Maybe I need a new want." Something shifted between them in that moment, a recognition that their paths, which had crossed by chance, might continue in the same direction by choice. But neither of them gave voice to the possibility. It was too soon, too uncertain in a world where the next hour wasn't guaranteed, let alone the next day. They resumed their journey as the afternoon waned, following the creek as it gradually widened. The terrain became more open, with rolling grasslands stretching to the horizon, dotted with occasional stands of pine and aspen. In the distance, the outline of buildings began to take shape. Miller's Crossing. As they approached the settlement, Preston grew more cautious, frequently scanning the surroundings for any sign of danger. "We'll circle around to the south," he decided. "Come in from a direction they won't expect if they're watching for us." The settlement was smaller than Aurora, just a cluster of buildings surrounding a crossroads. A general store, a blacksmith shop, a small church, and a handful of houses made up the entirety of Miller's Crossing. No saloon, Zoe noted with relief, less chance of Crowfield having influence here. They rode directly to the blacksmith's, where a burly man with a graying beard was closing up for the day. He eyed them suspiciously as they dismounted. "Shop's closed," he called. "Open again at dawn." "We're not here for your services, Mr. Miller," Preston replied, leading their horses closer. "Though we'd appreciate some water for our mounts." The blacksmith's eyes narrowed. "You know my name, but I don't know yours. Preston Quinn. This is Zoe Faulkner." Preston kept his voice low. "We're seeking shelter from Jeremiah Crowfield's men. I was told Miller's Crossing might be sympathetic to our situation." At the mention of Crowfield, the blacksmith's expression darkened. "Crowfield, is it? What's your quarrel with him?" "He murdered my aunt and has been forcing people off their land through fraud and intimidation," Preston said bluntly. "I've been gathering evidence against him for the past year." Miller studied them for a long moment, taking in their trail-worn appearance, Zoe's disheveled hair, and the bloodstain on Preston's sleeve. Finally, he nodded. "Come inside. My wife will have dinner ready and you can tell me your story where fewer ears might hear it." The blacksmith's home, attached to the rear of his shop, was modest but comfortable. His wife, Emma, a plump woman with kind eyes, welcomed them without question, setting 2 more places at the table and bringing a basin of warm water for them to wash away the dust of the trail. Over a simple but hearty meal of stew and cornbread, Preston explained their situation, showing Miller the ledger Zoe had taken from Voss's office and describing the evidence he'd gathered from other victims of Crowfield's schemes. "Crowfield's been trying to buy up land around here too," Miller said when Preston finished. "Sent one of his men last month with an offer for my shop. When I refused, accidents started happening. Customers' horses lost shoes mysteriously. Tools disappeared." "What did you do?" Zoe asked. Miller exchanged a glance with his wife. "We organized. Everyone in Miller's Crossing has had similar experiences with Crowfield, so we decided that any stranger who comes to town gets watched. Any trouble gets met with a unified response." A small settlement like this, standing up to someone as powerful as Crowfield, Preston sounded impressed. "We don't have much," Emma Miller said, serving coffee after the meal, "but what we have we've worked for, and we protect our own." "Which brings me to the question," Miller added, "of what to do with you two. If Crowfield's men are searching for you, they'll check every settlement within riding distance." "We need to lie low until the circuit judge arrives in Pueblo next week," Preston said. "After that, we can present our evidence and hopefully get warrants issued." Miller nodded thoughtfully. "There's an old trapper's cabin about 3 miles from here, up in the foothills. Nobody uses it much these days, but it's sound enough. You'd be safe there and we could bring you supplies." "That would be perfect," Preston said gratefully. "On one condition," Miller said, his expression serious. "When you take Crowfield down, you make sure it sticks. No slaps on the wrist, no fines he can afford to pay. Real justice." "That's exactly what I intend," Preston assured him. That night, the Millers insisted they stay in their home, offering Preston a pallet in the workshop and Zoe a small room off the kitchen that normally belonged to their daughter, who had married and moved to Denver the previous year. The bed, though narrow, was the most comfortable Zoe had slept in since leaving Missouri. She lay awake for a time, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the house settling and the distant hooting of an owl. Her mind wandered to Preston, to the way he'd looked at her by the creek, to the unspoken possibility that hung between them. She barely knew him, yet she'd trusted him with her life, and he'd trusted her in return when he had every reason to be suspicious of a woman who worked for his enemy. In the morning, the Millers provided them with fresh supplies, food, clean bandages for Preston's wound, a spare blanket, and a small revolver for Zoe, which Emma insisted she take. "A woman should be able to protect herself," Emma said firmly when Zoe hesitated. "Especially out here." They set off for the trapper's cabin with directions from Miller and a crude map he'd drawn. The day was clear, the spring air crisp and sweet with the scent of wildflowers. As they rode into the foothills, following a narrow game trail, Zoe found herself relaxing for the first time in days. They weren't safe yet, not by any measure, but they were no longer running blindly. The cabin, when they found it, was better than Zoe had expected, a solid structure of logs and stone, with a small spring nearby and enough clearing around it to spot anyone approaching. Inside was sparse but adequate. A stone fireplace, a rough wooden table with 2 chairs, a narrow bed in one corner, and shelves stocked with basic provisions left by previous occupants. "It's not the Silver Dollar Saloon," Preston said as they unpacked their supplies, "but I'd say it's a step up from scrubbing floors with bruised hands." Zoe smiled at the reference to their first meeting, just days ago, though it felt like a lifetime. Definitely an improvement. They settled into a routine over the next few days, taking turns keeping watch while the other rested, preparing simple meals over the fireplace, and discussing strategies for presenting their case to the judge. Every evening, one of the Millers' sons would ride out to check on them and bring news from town. On the 3rd day, young Jacob Miller reported that riders matching the description of Crowfield's men had indeed passed through Miller's crossing, asking questions that no one had answered truthfully. "Pa told them he saw a man and woman heading north toward the railroad," Jacob said with a grin. "They rode out that way yesterday and haven't been back." "That buys us some time," Preston said after the boy had left. "But they'll eventually circle back. Crowfield won't give up easily." "How many days until the judge reaches Pueblo?" Zoe asked, adding wood to the fire as the evening cooled. "4, according to Miller," Preston replied, cleaning his revolver at the table. "Then another day to present our evidence and get the warrants issued. And then it's over." Zoe stood by the fire watching the flames dance. Preston set down the gun and looked at her. "The legal battle will just be beginning. There will be trials, testimonies. Crowfield has resources, connections. It won't be quick or easy." Zoe nodded, understanding the implications. "And you'll need to be there for all of it." "Yes," Preston said quietly. "I started this fight. I need to see it through." The unasked question hung in the air between them. Where did that leave Zoe? She had no obligation to remain involved, no reason beyond the past few days' events to tie her fate to Preston's cause. "You could go anywhere after this," Preston continued, as if reading her thoughts. "Denver, Santa Fe, back east. With your testimony against Voss and Crowfield, there would probably even be a reward. Enough to start fresh somewhere." "Is that what you think I should do?" Zoe asked, turning to face him fully. Preston rose from the table and crossed the small cabin to stand before her. "I think," he said carefully, "that you should do whatever brings you closest to that want you mentioned somewhere to build something of your own." "And what about your want?" Zoe challenged softly. "You said you needed a new one once this is over." Preston's gaze dropped to her lips, then back to her eyes. "I think I might have found it," he murmured. "But I'm not sure I have the right to ask." Zoe's heart quickened. "You could try asking anyway." For a moment, Preston seemed on the verge of doing just that. Then, with visible effort, he stepped back. "It's too soon," he said. "You barely know me, and we're in the middle of a dangerous situation. I wouldn't want you to make a decision based on circumstances." "I think I'm capable of knowing my own mind," Zoe said, a touch of irritation in her voice. "Even in difficult circumstances." "I don't doubt that," Preston assured her. "But I've seen how trouble can push people together, make them feel things that might not last beyond the danger. I wouldn't want that for you, or for me." There was wisdom in his words, Zoe had to admit. They had known each other less than a week, most of that time spent running for their lives. What seemed like connection might indeed be nothing more than the intensity of shared peril. "Then we wait," she said finally, "until this is over and we can see clearly." Preston nodded, relief and regret mingled in his expression. "Until then." The next morning, Jacob Miller arrived earlier than usual, his horse lathered from hard riding. "Crowfield's men are back," he reported breathlessly. "6 of them, asking all over town. Someone must have talked, they know you're in the area." Preston and Zoe exchanged alarmed glances. "How much time do we have?" Preston asked. "Not long," Jacob replied. "Pa sent me to warn you while he tries to lead them in the wrong direction, but they're determined. And they've split up to search the hills." "We need to move," Preston said decisively, already gathering their essential belongings. "The judge won't reach Pueblo for another 3 days. We can't stay here that long." "Where will we go?" Zoe asked, rolling up the blankets. "South," Preston decided. "If we can reach Pueblo ahead of the judge, we can present our evidence to the marshal there. He might not be federal, but he's outside Crowfield's immediate influence." They packed quickly, taking only what was necessary for the journey. As they prepared to leave, Zoe paused at the cabin door, looking back at the simple space that had, however briefly, been a sanctuary. Preston noticed her hesitation. "Something wrong?" "No," she said, shaking her head. "It's just, for a few days this almost felt like having a home again." Preston's expression softened. "When this is over," he promised, "you'll have a real home, not a hiding place." They rode hard for the first few hours, taking a circuitous route that Jacob suggested might throw off pursuit. The terrain grew more rugged as they headed south, forcing them to slow their pace. By midday, they had reached a high ridge that offered a view of the valley behind them. "No sign of anyone following," Preston said, scanning the landscape with a small spyglass. "But that doesn't mean they're not out there." They continued until dusk, making camp in a sheltered ravine where their fire wouldn't be visible from a distance. The night was colder at this elevation, and they huddled close to the small blaze, sharing the last of the coffee Miller's wife had provided. "If we maintain this pace, we should reach Pueblo by tomorrow evening," Preston said, studying his map by firelight. "Just ahead of the judge." Zoe nodded, too tired for conversation. The constant vigilance, the physical demands of hard riding, and the emotional strain of their situation were taking their toll. She felt Preston's concerned gaze on her as she stared into the flames. "You should rest," he said gently. "I'll take the first watch." "Wake me in a few hours," Zoe insisted, wrapping herself in a blanket and settling against a fallen log. Sleep claimed her almost immediately. deep and dreamless, until Preston's hand on her shoulder roused her sometime in the darkest part of the night. "Your turn," he whispered. "All quiet so far." Zoe sat up, disoriented for a moment before the events of the past days returned to her consciousness. Preston handed her the revolver Emma Miller had given her, then took her place against the log. "If you see or hear anything suspicious, wake me immediately," he instructed, already closing his eyes. "Don't try to investigate on your own." "I'm not helpless," Zoe reminded him. A tired smile touched his lips. "I'm well aware, but we're stronger together." As Preston's breathing deepened into sleep, Zoe kept vigil, watching the stars wheel overhead and listening to the night sounds of the wilderness. In the distance, a wolf howled, a haunting sound that sent a shiver down her spine despite the blanket wrapped around her shoulders. She thought about what awaited them in Pueblo, the legal proceedings, the confrontation with Crowfield's influence, the uncertain future beyond. And she thought about Preston's words by the fire in the cabin, his reluctance to ask whatever it was he wanted to ask. She had her suspicions, of course, had seen the way he looked at her when he thought she wasn't noticing. But he was right to be cautious. Whatever was growing between them needed time and safety to be properly understood. The eastern sky was just beginning to lighten when Zoe heard it, the distant sound of hoofbeats, multiple riders approaching from the north. She moved quickly to Preston's side, shaking him awake. "They've found us," she whispered urgently. Preston was instantly alert, reaching for his revolver as he rose to a crouch. "How many? I can't tell." "Several from the sound of it," he nodded grimly. "Get the horses. We need to move before they can surround us." They broke camp with practiced efficiency, erasing all signs of their presence before mounting up. The hoofbeats were growing louder, closer. "This way," Preston said, leading them deeper into the ravine, away from the approaching riders. "There's a pass through these hills that should bring us to the Pueblo road." They rode at a brisk trot, the uneven ground making a gallop too dangerous in the dim pre-dawn light. Behind them, the sounds of pursuit continued, neither gaining nor falling back. As the sun crested the eastern hills, they emerged from the ravine onto a broad slope dotted with pine trees. Below them, perhaps 5 miles distant, lay a winding road that Preston identified as their route to Pueblo. "If we can reach that road," he said, "we'll make better time. Might even encounter other travelers' safety in numbers." But as they started down the slope, riders appeared on the ridge behind them, 5 men, their silhouettes stark against the morning sky. "There they are," one shouted, and the chase began in earnest. Preston and Zoe urged their horses to a gallop, weaving through the trees as bullets whined past them. The ground was treacherous, with hidden rocks and sudden dips that threatened to bring down their mounts. "The trees thin out ahead," Preston called to Zoe. "When we reach the clearing, break right toward that outcropping. I'll go left and draw their fire." "No," Zoe protested. "We stay together, trust me," Preston insisted. "It's our best chance." Before she could argue further, they burst from the tree line into an open meadow. Preston immediately veered left, spurring his horse to greater speed. As he'd predicted, the pursuers focused on him, the more visible target. Zoe hesitated only briefly before following his instruction, turning her mare toward the rocky outcropping. She glanced back to see Preston zigzagging across the meadow, drawing the riders away from her path. A fresh volley of gunfire erupted, and to her horror, she saw Preston jerk in the saddle, then slump forward. "Preston!" she screamed, instinctively pulling her horse around. But Preston had not fallen. Despite whatever injury he'd sustained, he remained mounted, continuing his desperate ride across the open ground. Their eyes met across the distance, and even from afar, Zoe could read his message: "Keep going." With a wrenching feeling in her chest, she turned her mare back toward the outcropping. If Preston was creating a diversion, she could not waste it. The best way to help him was to reach safety and ensure their evidence wasn't lost. She reached the rocks and guided her horse along their base, seeking the pass Preston had mentioned. Finding a narrow gap, she urged her mount through, emerging on the other side to find a steep path that descended toward the road below. The sounds of gunfire had ceased, leaving an ominous silence. Zoe paused, torn between continuing toward Pueblo and turning back to find Preston. The logical choice was clear: the evidence she carried could bring down Crowfield and his entire operation. Preston would want her to get it to safety, but logic had little to do with the fear gripping her heart. In just a few days, Preston Quinn had become more important to her than she'd been prepared to admit, even to herself. The thought of him injured or worse, alone against 5 armed men, was unbearable. Decision made, Zoe dismounted and secured her horse in a sheltered spot with access to a small stream that trickled down the rocks. She took Voss's ledger and the revolver, then climbed back up to the gap in the outcropping, moving carefully to avoid dislodging loose stones that might betray her presence. From this vantage point, she could see across the meadow to the tree line where they'd emerged. There was no sign of Preston or their pursuers. They must have continued into the woods on the far side, she reasoned, following the direction Preston had been heading when she last saw him. Keeping low, Zoe made her way along the top of the outcropping, searching for a better view. The morning sun was fully risen now, casting long shadows across the landscape and glinting off something metal in the distance, a gun barrel perhaps, or a buckle. She froze, watching as figures moved among the trees about a quarter-mile away. 3 men on horseback, moving slowly as if searching for something or someone. 2 others remained at the edge of the woods, one holding the reins of 5 horses, including Preston's dun gelding. But where was Preston? As if in answer to her unspoken question, 2 of the men in the trees suddenly called out, converging on a spot Zoe couldn't see. A moment later, they dragged a struggling figure into the open Preston, his hands bound behind him, blood staining the side of his shirt. Cold fear gripped Zoe as the men forced Preston to his knees. Even at this distance, their intention was clear. They weren't taking him back to Crowfield. They were going to execute him on the spot. Without conscious thought, Zoe raised the revolver Emma Miller had given her. The distance was too great for accuracy, especially with a handgun she'd never fired before. But she had to try something. Taking careful aim, she squeezed the trigger. The gun bucked in her hand, the report echoing off the rocks around her. She missed her target, the man standing over Preston, but the bullet struck close enough to scatter dirt at his feet. The unexpected gunfire caused momentary confusion below. The men looked around, seeking the source of the shot. Zoe fired again, this time aiming for the ground near the horses. The animals shied nervously, and one broke free from the man holding their reins. In the chaos, Preston acted. Despite his bound hands, he lunged forward, knocking down the nearest captor and rolling toward the tree line. The other men recovered quickly, raising their rifles, but Zoe fired a 3rd time, forcing them to duck for cover. Preston disappeared into the undergrowth as his captors fired blindly after him. Zoe, her position now revealed, knew she had only moments before they redirected their attention to her. Scrambling back from the edge of the outcropping, she hurried to where she'd left her horse. She had to assume Preston would head for the road. It was their agreed destination, and the most direct route to safety. She mounted quickly and guided her mare down the steep path, moving as fast as she dared on the treacherous slope. Behind her, She could hear shouts as the men discovered her position and began to pursue. The road was still several miles away, across open country with little cover. Zoe knew her mare was faster than the pursuers' tired mounts, but she couldn't outrun bullets. Her only advantage was the head start Preston's diversion had bought her. As she reached the bottom of the slope, a figure emerged from a cluster of boulders to her right. Preston, his shirt torn and bloodied, his face scratched from branches but wonderfully, impossibly alive. "Preston," she cried, turning her horse toward him, "keep riding." He shouted back, waving her on. "They're right behind me." But Zoe couldn't leave him. She urged her mare closer, extending her hand as she'd seen cowboys do when picking up a fallen comrade. "Come on." Preston hesitated only briefly before grasping her arm and swinging up behind her in one fluid motion, despite his injured state and bound hands. The mare protested the additional weight, but maintained her footing. "The road," Preston directed, his voice tight with pain. "If we can reach it, there might be others who can help." Zoe guided the mare toward the distant line that marked the Pueblo road, feeling Preston's arms encircle her waist as he held on. Behind them, shots rang out as their pursuers emerged from the hills, but the distance was too great for accuracy. The mare, burdened with two riders, couldn't sustain a gallop for long. They settled into a ground-eating lope that was just fast enough to maintain their lead. "Are you badly hurt?" Zoe asked over her shoulder, feeling warm wetness seeping through her dress where Preston's chest pressed against her back. "Bullet grazed my side," he replied tersely. "Nothing fatal, but I could use a hand with these ropes when we have a moment." The road grew closer, a dusty ribbon winding through the rolling grasslands, and on it, moving toward them, was a welcome sight: a wagon train, perhaps a dozen vehicles accompanied by mounted outriders. "Settlers," Preston said with relief, "or merchants. Either way, Crowfield's men won't risk a confrontation with so many witnesses." Sure enough, as they closed the distance to the road, their pursuers reined in, watching from the base of the hills as Zoe and Preston approached the wagon train. The lead wagon halted as they drew near, and a bearded man in a dusty duster raised his hand in greeting. "Trouble," he called, eyeing their disheveled appearance and the distant riders. "Yes, sir," Preston replied. "Those men are trying to prevent us from reaching Pueblo with evidence of serious crimes." The man studied them for a moment, then the riders on the hillside. "Evidence, you say?" "Against Jeremiah Crowfield," Zoe added, "for fraud, intimidation, and murder." At the mention of Crowfield, several of the wagoneers exchanged glances. "Crowfield, eh?" the leader said thoughtfully. "Lost my brother's ranch to that bastard last year. Convenient accident with a stampede." He gestured toward his wagon. "Climb aboard. We're bound for Pueblo ourselves." Gratefully, they dismounted, Preston wincing as Zoe helped him up into the wagon. One of the other travelers, a grizzled old-timer with a splinted leg, produced a knife to cut Preston's bonds while the leader ordered two of his mounted companions to keep an eye on their back trail. "Name's Daniels," the wagon leader introduced himself. "Freight hauler. We make this run every month between Denver and Santa Fe." "Preston Quinn," Preston replied, shaking the man's hand. "And this is Zoe Faulkner. We're in your debt, Mr. Daniels." "Any enemy of Crowfield is a friend of mine," Daniels said simply. "Let's get that wound tended to, and you can tell us your story as we ride." As the wagon train resumed its journey, Zoe helped the old-timer who introduced himself as Doc. Though he admitted he'd never had formal medical training clean and bandage Preston's wound. It was, as Preston had claimed, not life-threatening. A deep furrow along his ribs that bled freely but hadn't penetrated to anything vital. "Lucky," Doc pronounced. applying a poultice of herbs he extracted from a battered tin. Another inch to the left, and we'd be having a different conversation. Once Preston was patched up and had accepted a swig from Doc's flask, medicinal purposes only. The old man insisted. With a wink he explained their situation to Daniels and the others within earshot. He recounted his aunt's death, the evidence they'd gathered, and their narrow escape from Aurora. "And the ledger?" Daniels asked. "You still have it?" "Right here," Zoe confirmed, producing it from inside her dress where she'd concealed it. Daniels examined a few pages, his expression darkening. "This is damning stuff," he said. "Names, dates, amounts. If this gets to the right judge, Crowfield's finished." "That's the plan," Preston said. "The circuit judge arrives in Pueblo tomorrow. With this evidence and our testimony, he should issue warrants immediately." "Well, you'll get there in time," Daniels assured them. "We'll reach Pueblo by nightfall, and I'd like to be present when you present this to the judge. Might have some testimony of my own to add." As the wagon train continued southward, Zoe found herself seated beside Preston on a pile of burlap sacks, the gentle rocking of the wagon almost soothing after days of hard riding. Despite the lingering danger, Crowfield's men were still out there, possibly riding for reinforcements. She felt a sense of cautious optimism. "Thank you," Preston said quietly, his voice pitched for her ears alone, "for coming back for me. It was a foolish, reckless thing to do, but I'm alive because of it." "You would have done the same," Zoe replied, not meeting his gaze. "Yes," he agreed, "but that doesn't make it any less remarkable." He paused, then added, "or any less meaningful to me." Zoe looked at him then, taking in his tired face, the sincerity in his blue eyes. "I couldn't leave you," she said simply. "I discovered I didn't want to." Preston's hand found hers among the folds of her skirt, his fingers warm as they intertwined with her own. "When this is over," he began, but Zoe shook her head. "Not yet," she reminded him. "We agreed to wait until we can see clearly." A smile touched his lips. "So we did, but I find my vision improving by the hour." They reached Pueblo as the sun was setting, the wagon train rolling into the bustling town with its mix of adobe and wooden buildings, its streets alive with commerce and activity. Daniels directed the convoy to a freighting yard on the eastern edge of town, where the wagons would be unloaded and the goods stored in warehouses. "You'll need a safe place to stay tonight," he told Preston and Zoe as they prepared to disembark. "Crowfield has eyes everywhere, even here. I suggest the Franklin house. It's owned by a friend of mine who has no love for Crowfield. I'll send word ahead that you're coming." "We're grateful for all your help," Preston said, shaking the man's hand again. "Just make sure that ledger reaches the judge," Daniels replied. "Justice for your aunt means justice for a lot of people Crowfield has wronged." The Franklin house was a modest hotel near the courthouse, its proprietor a widow named Mrs. Abernathy, who welcomed them warmly upon hearing Daniels's name. Despite their disheveled appearance, she provided them with adjacent rooms, hot water for bathing, and the promise of clean clothes by morning. "Daniels said you've had a difficult journey," she said, showing Zoe to her room. "Rest now. You're safe here." After the door closed behind the kindly woman, Zoe sat on the edge of the bed, the first real bed she'd seen in days. The room was simple but clean, with a washstand, a small writing desk, and a window overlooking the main street. It felt strange to be surrounded by walls and a roof after so many nights under the stars or in the rustic trapper's cabin. A soft knock at the connecting door drew her attention. "Zoe," Preston's voice was muffled by the wood. "May I come in for a moment?" She crossed to the door and opened it. Preston had washed the dust from his face and hands, and someone had provided him with a clean shirt, though his trousers were still trail-worn. Mrs. Abernathy says the circuit judge is indeed arriving tomorrow, he reported. Around noon on the eastbound stage. He'll begin hearing cases immediately. Then by this time tomorrow, it could all be over, Zoe said, the realization washing over her with a mixture of relief and uncertainty. The initial part, at least, Preston agreed. Though as I said before, the legal process will take time. Zoe nodded, suddenly acutely aware of their proximity in the small room, of the bed behind her, of the fact that for the first time since they'd fled Aurora, they were truly alone, with no immediate danger pressing upon them. Preston seemed to realize it too, his gaze softening as it moved over her face. "I should let you rest," he said, stepping back toward the connecting door. "We have an important day ahead." "Yes," Zoe agreed, though part of her wanted him to stay, to continue the conversation they'd started in the wagon, to explore the possibilities that awaited them beyond the shadow of Crowfield's threat. "Good night, Zoe," Preston said, his hand on the doorknob. "And thank you for everything." "Good night, Preston." After he'd gone, Zoe made use of the hot water Mrs. Abernathy had provided, washing away the grime of travel and changing into a clean nightgown that had been laid out for her, likely belonging to their hostess, or perhaps her daughter. The simple luxury of cleanliness after days on the trail was almost overwhelming. She slept deeply that night, dreamless and undisturbed, awakening to sunlight streaming through the curtains and the sounds of a town beginning its day. For a moment she was disoriented, the comfort of the bed and the ceiling above her unfamiliar after so many nights outdoors. Then it all came rushing back, their flight from Aurora, the chase through the hills, Preston's capture and her desperate rescue, and finally, their arrival in Pueblo. Today they would face the circuit judge and, if all went well, set in motion the legal proceedings that would bring Jeremiah Crowfield to justice. A fresh dress had been laid across the chair while she slept, a simple blue cotton garment that, while not a perfect fit, was far better than her travel-stained clothes. After dressing and arranging her hair as best she could without proper pins or combs, Zoe knocked on the connecting door. Preston answered immediately, as if he'd been waiting. He too had been provided with fresh clothing, a clean white shirt, dark trousers, and even a vest that, though slightly loose across the shoulders, gave him a more respectable appearance than his trail gear. "Good morning," he greeted her with a smile that reached his eyes. "You look rested." "As do you," she replied, noting that color had returned to his face after the pallor of yesterday's injury. "How's your side?" "Sore, but healing," Preston said. "Mrs. Abernathy sent up fresh bandages this morning. The woman thinks of everything." "She seems very kind," Zoe agreed. "And discreet," Preston added. "She asked no questions about our situation, only offered her assistance for whatever we might need." They descended to the dining room where a hearty breakfast awaited them. As they ate, Mrs. Abernathy informed them that the stage carrying Judge Hamilton was expected around 11 o'clock, and that she had taken the liberty of sending word to the courthouse that they wished to speak with him upon his arrival. "Daniels came by earlier," she added. "He'll meet you at the courthouse with several others who have grievances against Crowfield. Strength in numbers," he said. "He's a good man," Preston said appreciatively. After breakfast, they made their way to the courthouse, a substantial stone building in the center of town. Already, a small crowd had gathered on its steps, and Zoe recognized several faces from Daniels's wagon train among them. Daniels himself approached as they neared, shaking Preston's hand and nodding politely to Zoe. "Word has spread," he explained, gesturing to the assembled men and women. "These are all people who have been wronged by Crowfield in some way. When they heard someone was finally bringing evidence against him, they came to show support. "This is more than I'd hoped for," Preston said, visibly moved by the display. As 11 o'clock approached, the crowd grew larger, drawing the attention of the town marshal, who came to investigate the unusual gathering. After Daniels explained the situation, the lawman nodded thoughtfully. "Been hearing complaints about Crowfield for years," he admitted. "But without solid evidence, and with his influence in the territorial government, there wasn't much I could do." He glanced at the ledger Preston was holding. "If that contains what you say it does, I'll be more than happy to execute any warrants Judge Hamilton issues." The stage arrived precisely at 11, dust billowing around it as it pulled to a stop before the hotel across the street from the courthouse. A distinguished-looking man in his 60s, with silver hair and a neatly trimmed beard, descended first, stretching his back after the long journey. "Judge Hamilton," the marshal called, crossing to greet him. "Welcome back to Pueblo." As the two men conversed, the marshal occasionally gesturing toward the crowd at the courthouse, Zoe felt Preston tense beside her. "What is it?" she asked, following his gaze. "The man who just got off the stage," Preston said quietly, nodding toward a portly gentleman in an expensive suit who was directing the removal of his luggage. "That's Jeremiah Crowfield." Zoe's breath caught in her throat. "Here, now, it makes sense," Preston said grimly. "He knows I've been gathering evidence. He probably planned to influence the judge before any complaints could be filed." Their conversation was interrupted as the marshal returned, accompanied by Judge Hamilton. The older man surveyed the crowd with interest. "Marshal Turner tells me you have evidence of serious crimes to present," he said, addressing Preston directly. "I'd be glad to hear it immediately, before my regular docket begins at 1 o'clock. "Thank you, Your Honor," Preston replied, unable to keep the relief from his voice. "We appreciate your willingness to listen." As they prepared to enter the courthouse, a shout from across the street drew everyone's attention. "Quinn!" Crowfield stood on the hotel steps, his face contorted with rage as he recognized Preston among the crowd. Behind him, two men who could only be his bodyguards reached inside their coats. "This is a legal proceeding, Mr. Crowfield," Judge Hamilton called firmly. "If you have business with the court, you may present it in due course." "That man is a liar and a thief," Crowfield snarled, descending the hotel steps. "Whatever he's told you is fabricated. Interesting that you would know what he's told me when I haven't heard it myself yet," the judge observed dryly. "Perhaps you should join us inside, where all parties can be heard in a civilized manner." Crowfield hesitated, clearly caught off guard by the judge's invitation. After a moment, he nodded curtly. "Fine. Let's hear these absurd accusations." The courtroom was quickly filled to capacity, with Daniels and the other witnesses taking seats behind Preston and Zoe. Crowfield and his men positioned themselves on the opposite side of the aisle, the rancher's face a mask of contempt. Judge Hamilton took his place at the bench, calling the impromptu hearing to order. "Now, Mr. Quinn, please present your evidence." For the next hour, Preston outlined the case against Crowfield, beginning with his aunt's suspicious death, and proceeding through the pattern of fraud, intimidation, and violence that had allowed the rancher to amass his considerable holdings. He introduced Voss's ledger, which detailed payments for special services rendered against property owners who refused to sell. Zoe testified about what she had overheard at the livery stable in Aurora, the plan to ambush Preston and destroy his evidence, and about Voss's reaction when Preston had publicly questioned the circumstances of Martha Simmons's death. One by one, others came forward. A farmer whose crops had been mysteriously trampled just before harvest, forcing him to sell his land at a fraction of its worth. a widow whose water rights had been challenged with forged documents, a shopkeeper who'd been burned out after refusing to pay protection to Crowfield's men. Throughout it all, Crowfield sat in stony silence, occasionally whispering to his bodyguards or making notes on a small pad of paper. His composure only broke when Daniels presented a deed to his brother's ranch, which experts had already determined contained a forged signature. "This is absurd," Crowfield finally erupted, rising to his feet. "These people are disgruntled because they failed where I succeeded. Business in the territories is competitive. If they couldn't maintain their properties, that's hardly my fault." "Forgery is not competitive business, Mr. Crowfield," Judge Hamilton said severely, "nor is intimidation, arson, or murder." "You have no proof of murder," Crowfield sneered. "Perhaps not yet," the judge conceded. "But there is certainly enough evidence of other crimes to warrant a full investigation." He turned to Marshal Turner. "I am issuing warrants for the arrest of Jeremiah Crowfield on multiple counts of fraud, forgery, intimidation, and conspiracy. I am also issuing warrants for Hiram Voss and others named in this ledger." Crowfield's face darkened with rage. "You can't do this. Do you know who I am? Who my friends are in the territorial government?" "I am well aware of your connections, Mr. Crowfield," Judge Hamilton replied calmly. "Which is precisely why this matter will be referred to the federal court in Denver, where your influence is somewhat less pervasive." As Marshal Turner moved to arrest Crowfield, the rancher's bodyguards tensed, hands moving toward their weapons. But faced with the marshal's deputies and the crowd of witnesses, they thought better of resistance. "This isn't over, Quinn," Crowfield growled as he was led away. "Not by a long shot." "Yes, it is," Preston replied steadily. "It was over the moment you decided my aunt's life was worth less than her property." After Crowfield had been taken to the jail, Judge Hamilton addressed the remaining witnesses. "I want to thank all of you for your courage in coming forward. The territorial court will continue to gather evidence, and you may be called to testify in the formal trial. In the meantime, I am issuing an injunction freezing all of Crowfield's assets pending the outcome of the investigation." As the crowd dispersed, many stopping to shake Preston's hand or pat him on the back, Zoe found herself overcome with emotion. It had happened so quickly, this justice they'd sought at such risk. Crowfield was in custody, his power at least temporarily checked, and the truth about his operations was finally in the open. Preston found her sitting on a bench outside the courtroom, tears streaming silently down her face. He sat beside her, taking her hand in his. "It's over," he said softly. "We did it." Zoe nodded, unable to speak for a moment. "I keep thinking about all the people he hurt," she finally managed. "Your aunt, the farmers, even the people of Aurora who live under Voss's thumb. Will this really help them?" "It's a start," Preston said. "The injunction means Crowfield can't continue buying up land or forcing people out, and once Voss is arrested, Aurora will have a chance to elect honest leadership." He squeezed her hand gently. "It won't bring back those who were lost, but it might prevent others from suffering the same fate." They sat in companionable silence for a time, the weight of the past days gradually lifting from their shoulders. Eventually, Daniels approached, his expression pleased but serious. "Judge Hamilton wants to speak with you both," he informed them, "in his chambers." They followed Daniels back into the courthouse, where they were shown to a well-appointed office. Judge Hamilton was seated behind a large desk, reviewing the documents they had presented earlier. "Ah, Mr. Quinn, Miss Faulkner," he greeted them, gesturing to chairs. "Please sit down. I wanted to speak with you privately before I continue with the day's regular cases." Once they were seated, the judge leaned forward, folding his hands on the desk. What you've done today is remarkable. Crowfield has been operating with impunity for years, and no one has managed to gather the evidence necessary to bring him to account. Thank you, Your Honor, Preston replied, but the credit belongs to many people, including those who testified today. Indeed, Hamilton agreed. However, I must warn you that this is just the beginning of what will likely be a lengthy legal process. Crowfield has resources and connections. While I believe the evidence is strong enough to secure indictments, a conviction is never certain. We understand, Preston said. We're prepared to see this through to the end. The judge nodded approvingly. Good. Now there is the matter of your own safety to consider. Crowfield's reach extends beyond his immediate associates. Until the trial, you may both be in danger. We've considered that, Preston admitted. Though we haven't had much time to make plans. I may have a solution, Hamilton said. I have a colleague, Judge Prescott, who oversees a district in northern New Mexico territory. He's been looking for a deputy marshal with experience in land disputes and the courage to enforce the law without bias. He looked pointedly at Preston. Based on what I've seen today, you would be an excellent candidate for the position. Preston straightened in his chair. You're offering me a job, recommending you for one, Hamilton corrected. The final decision would be Judge Prescott's, of course, but my endorsement carries weight, and it would take you out of Colorado, away from Crowfield's most direct influence. That's very generous, Preston said, clearly taken aback by the offer. But what about the case against Crowfield? Don't I need to remain here? You would be required to return for the trial, certainly, Hamilton acknowledged, but that won't be for several months at least. In the meantime, you would be serving the law in an official capacity, with the protection that affords. Preston glanced at Zoe, an unspoken question in his eyes. She realized he was considering not just his own future, but hers as well, whether she would be willing to follow him to yet another new place, to build something in a territory even more remote than Colorado. It sounds like a wonderful opportunity, she said, answering his unasked question. For both of us. The tension in Preston's shoulders visibly eased at her words. He turned back to the judge. I would be honored to accept your recommendation, Your Honor. Excellent, Hamilton said, writing a brief note on a piece of official stationery. I'll send a telegram to Prescott this afternoon. In the meantime, I suggest you both remain in Pueblo for a few days, at least until we've had time to execute the warrants on Voss and the others named in the ledger. As they left the judge's chambers, Preston took Zoe's arm, guiding her to a quiet corner of the courthouse hallway. Did you mean what you said in there? He asked, his voice low and intent. About it being an opportunity for both of us. I did, Zoe confirmed. Unless you don't want me to come with you. Not want you. Preston shook his head incredulously. Zoe, the only thing that's made the idea of going to New Mexico appealing is the thought that you might be willing to go with me. Then ask me, Zoe said softly. Whatever it is you've been wanting to ask since that night in the cabin. Preston's expression grew serious. It's still so soon, he began, but Zoe interrupted him. We've faced death together, Preston. We've saved each other's lives. We've brought down a powerful man who thought himself untouchable. She took his hands in hers. I think we've earned the right to see clearly now, even if it's only been a week. A slow smile spread across Preston's face. You're right, as usual. He drew a deep breath. Zoe Faulkner, I know we met under the strangest of circumstances, with you scrubbing floors with bruised hands and me offering you salve and a way out of a bad situation. But somewhere between Aurora and here, between running for our lives and fighting for justice, I realized something. I don't want to go to New Mexico or anywhere else without you. Is that a proposal, Deputy Marshal Quinn? Zoe asked, her heart racing. It is, Preston confirmed, though I'd planned something more romantic than a courthouse hallway. He hesitated. It's not just about convenience or safety, Zoe. It's about who we are together better, stronger, more than we are apart. I've never felt that with anyone before. Neither have I, Zoe admitted. And yes, Preston Quinn, I will go to New Mexico with you, as your wife, if that's what you're asking. It is, he said, his voice rough with emotion. Definitely what I'm asking. He leaned down and kissed her then. A gentle meeting of lips that quickly deepened into something more, a promise. A beginning, the first page of a new chapter neither of them had anticipated when their paths crossed in the Silver Dollar Saloon. 3 weeks later, they were married in a simple ceremony at Miller's Crossing, where they had stopped on their journey south to thank the blacksmith and his wife for their help. Emma Miller had insisted on hosting the wedding, declaring that every bride deserved a proper celebration, no matter how hastily arranged. The small church was filled with well-wishers, the Millers and their neighbors, Daniels and several of his wagon train companions, and even Mrs. Abernathy, who had journeyed from Pueblo with a wedding gift of fine linens. Zoe wore a dress that Emma and the local seamstress had altered from one of the Miller daughters' gowns, simple but elegant, with lace at the collar and cuffs. Preston, resplendent in a new suit purchased in Pueblo, watched her walk down the aisle with an expression of such undisguised happiness that Zoe felt her own heart might burst with joy. They exchanged vows before the local minister, promising to love and cherish each other through whatever life might bring. When Preston slipped a gold band onto her finger, a band that had once belonged to his mother, carefully preserved through years of wandering, Zoe felt as though the bruised, weary woman who had scrubbed floors in Aurora was finally laid to rest, replaced by someone stronger, someone who had found not just safety but partnership. After the ceremony, as they celebrated with cake and punch in the Miller's garden, Preston drew Zoe aside, his expression suddenly serious. "Before we leave for New Mexico," he said, "there's something I need to tell you, something I should have mentioned before." Zoe's heart skipped a beat. "What is it?" "My Aunt Martha, she left me more than just a mission to bring Crowfield to justice," Preston explained. "She left me her property as well. With Voss's arrest and the evidence we presented, the deed to the Silver Dollar Saloon has been returned to me as her rightful heir." "The saloon," Zoe echoed, surprised. "But I thought we were going to New Mexico." "We are," Preston assured her. "Judge Prescott's telegram confirmed the position, but I thought you should know that we have options. The saloon could be sold, or we could keep it and hire someone to manage it in our absence." "Or," Zoe prompted, sensing there was more to his thoughts. Preston smiled. "Or if New Mexico doesn't suit us, we could return to Aurora someday. Not to the saloon as it was, but perhaps transform it into something better, a proper hotel, maybe, or a restaurant. Something that would honor my aunt's memory and give the town a fresh start." "Something built with our own hands," Zoe mused, recalling her expressed wish for a place that couldn't be taken away. "I like that idea, Preston. Not right away, perhaps, but someday." "Someday," he agreed, pulling her close. "For now, we have a new beginning waiting for us in New Mexico. A home to create together." Zoe leaned into his embrace, marveling at how much had changed in so short a time. From scrubbing floors with bruised hands to standing as a newly wedded bride, from isolated desperation to cherished partnership, the journey had been both harrowing and healing. "To think," she murmured against Preston's shoulder, "all of this began because you noticed my hands." "No," Preston corrected gently, tilting her face up to his. "It began because you had the courage to keep going even when your hands were bruised. I just offered the salve." "And something better," Zoe added with a smile. And something better, Preston agreed, sealing the words with a kiss that promised all the tomorrows yet to come.